Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, there's no surprise and no shock, obviously, that Europe as a whole wants to react in some fashion to the attacks that have taken place in places like France as well as Austria, what are called quote-unquote Islamist attacks. Of course, there's less talk about the far-right attacks, but that's a show and a topic for another day, which we have, of course, covered a number of times here in Scope. Nevertheless, if we talk about the kinds of attacks that have been carried out by a number of people who would claim that they are doing it for their sake of their faith or religion as Muslims, etc. And of course, they've been condemned by the vast majority of even European Muslims. Nevertheless, the European states together are coming as a whole and are talking about the kinds of measures that they can enact then to prevent such attacks from happening altogether. There's a number of mosques, for example, that have been shut down or are possibly going to be shut down in Austria. One mosque at the very least has been shut down in France as well. What other measures will be taken? Possibly also a look at private messaging apps. That's something that should worry not just Muslim citizens of Europe, but everybody in Europe, because that then we're entering into dangerous territory vis-a-vis privacy in using these messaging apps, etc., that we all, of course, pride ourselves on that privacy for. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. There's a lot, of course, to get through, and I should also mention that just over the past couple of days, there have been two mosques that have been attacked, one in the Netherlands and one in Germany, and that's not to say that there have been other attacks and threats, at the very least, of attacks across Europe in places such as France as well on mosques. We're joined now by Nadia Moulay, who is a commentator, journalist, and writer. She's joining us today from Paris. Joining us from Birmingham is Dr. Chris Allen, who is an associate professor at the School of Criminology at the University of Leicester. Chris and Nadia, thank you both for your time today. Nadia, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the French proposals in reaction to what it is called, of course, Islamic extremism? There's talk about, the Schengen visa-free zone. There's talk about, moderating online content and, the pact on asylum and migration, et cetera, separatism, as Macron has also said. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's very interesting to see that France, like EU, European Union, has a big difficulty, for example, to implement political around military political, for example, or around different issues. But they have a common area around the question of the values and the question of the cultural issues. And I think it is a point of what you are saying about Macron's choice to turn into the Schengen space and to speak about separatism in France, to stigmatize Muslim people in France, for example, etc., etc. And I think that when we don't succeed to have a common political around different issues, we have the trend in France and in European Union to stigmatize the same people. I think it is quite common to act like this.
So, the argument obviously on the part of these governments would be, we need to act, we need to do something. But is this the way to go?
Well, I think some of the things that we're seeing at the kind of European level now are some of those things that we've seen in the UK over the past 10 years. I think that where we're moving is towards this idea where a handful of people's actions and activities are now being attributed to whole communities and to a whole religion as well. And one of the things that's kind of emerged in the UK, and which I see now kind of spreading across as well, is this idea that all Muslims, irrespective, are responsible for the actions of a few. And I think that what this has done is that it's begun to kind of stigmatise Muslims. It's begun to, it's definitely made Muslims feel as though they can never be a part of who we are, so, we're talking in the UK, I mean, obviously in other parts of Europe as well, third, fourth, fifth generation, Muslim communities, but still seem to be outside, still seem to be other. And I think that this is really kind of, has an impact on both like kind of Muslim and non-Muslim communities, in Britain and the rest of Europe. and it's very easy to kind of get to that stage where, you project all of society's problems onto these groups of people, and actually targeting them and kind of attacking very basic things like you said in your introduction, attending mosques. This is now seen to be somehow a kind of part of that kind of that move towards being radicalized or being extremist. Wanting to have halal meat. It seems to be problematic in the wider society. So I think that's what the problem here is really around this kind of idea around this kind of stigmatization and the marginalization and blaming of Muslims.
Yeah, the honest. If we're completely honest with each other, these governments will tell us that the Muslim community needs to do more to control extremism. At least that's what the accusation on the part of these governments is towards European Muslims. How do you respond to that?
I think it's very particular in France because, as you know, you have secularism law and secularism history. The link to the religion is very, very specific in France. And I think that as other people in France, Muslim people are very shocked and moved by the different tragedies. Today is the 55th anniversary of Bataclan massacre. We are the 13th November, and what I would like to say is it is a paradox. I would like to point the paradox because most time of the year Muslim people are invited to be invisible, to be to speak as French people, not as Muslim people. And when there is an attack, an assault, where there is a massacre and people are killing in the name of Islam, unfortunately, French authorities ask them to speak up like Muslim. And it is a very true paradox for them. That's why they don't know how really to be. If they does they have to speak like French people? Does they like to speak like Muslim people? And I think it speaks about the paradox of French authorities. We doesn't succeed to face his history, to face his communities, these different communities, and to speak a common language to be more heard by these people.
Chris, there's a slippery slope, isn't there, here? Because when we're looking especially at what's being proposed vis-a-vis, the Schengen visa-free zone, I'm sure there's a lot to talk about there, but then especially online content, right? And that's something that's, I know, a very sensitive area for anybody, anywhere in the world, especially in democratic countries, because that's a value that we all pride as very valuable to us, right? Do you think that this is the time to be then talking about the kind of online content that we should allow our governments access to, i.e. private message apps?
I think again, this is, it's such a complex issue. One of the things that we've seen in recent years is a proliferation of, kind of hateful material online around Muslims and the religion of Islam. We see in this, we're seeing all forms of extremism finding, new avenues, new outlets, as kind of, social media platforms develop and change and multiply, of course, so it becomes very, very difficult in terms of this. And I think that one of the things, again, is just by focusing in on kind of, on Muslims and the content that Muslims access and the way in which Muslims use, kind of social media platforms and so on, becomes very, very, very problematic. We need to contextualize this within the setting of civil liberties. We need to contextualize this within the context of privacy laws. And if we go back and look at human rights legislation and those kind of elements that Europe and the Western world tends to pull out when it talks about European values and Western values and so on, are these things around liberty? Are these things around human rights? Are these things around sort of having the right to privacy, right to freedom of expression, and so on? And obviously, there's a difference between kind of horrific content, but actually trying to suggest that there is a need to infiltrate people's personal messages as a means of trying to stop this this perceived problem.
Yeah.
Well, we already know that intelligence services have this capability. They are able to do this. We have legislation in place which allows this. And we've seen that from, both from, in the UK, extreme right wing, plus also Islamist inspired terrorism. We've seen plots which have been foiled through this process of intelligence. So it seems to be working. I don't see why we need to start stripping certain communities of their civil liberties or their human rights. It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Very well. There's a final word, but we appreciate both Chris and Nadia for their time today and for sharing their expert insight with us. Nadia, they're speaking to us from Paris, and Chris there was sharing his thoughts from Birmingham. This is an extremely important topic, right? Because what's on the table right now, and I've already outlined that with my guests, online content moderation, a stricter proposal on migration and asylum, a reform of the Schengen visa-free zone. We've already had within Austria around 33, I think it was, Muslim academics and activists who were briefly detained. Some of them, I believe, are still detained without any charge. There hasn't been any explanation about why this may be occurring. All authorities have said this is to obstruct terrorism. What does that mean? This was one lone man who carried out a criminal act, and anyone who carries out a criminal act who then connects it with his or her respective faith, does that mean we then generalize the entire group of followers of that faith? Does this even make logical sense at this time when Europe is dealing with so many other issues? Will Europe also react this way to far-right terrorism, for example? These are all open-ended questions that really need to be answered at a time when all of the above leaders also talk then about harmony, tolerance, acceptance, etc. within their societies. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, new German research has come out, according to a German think tank, which carried out research both in the occupied territories as well as in important countries throughout the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Qatar, and even, in fact, in Europe, in Germany itself. Now, this poll, as in a previous poll that came out of Qatar as well, gives you an idea about what the Arab street is feeling about these Abraham Accords, as well as, normalization of ties with Israel, and just overall on the issue of Israel-Palestine altogether. On the Abraham Accords, Qataris and Saudis were against those deals largely. Saudis, Bahrainis, Qataris, Moroccans altogether believe that Israel is in fact a greater threat to them, and I believe to the region as well, than Iran. And that's something that's, of course, spoken about a lot in this region also. Only 46%, interestingly, of Emiratis and 31% of Bahrainis, in fact, currently at least, have favorable impressions of Israel, even though their respective countries have now normalized their ties with Israel. What does all of this mean? How much of an impact does this really have? Because the Arab street, mind you, has always sided with Palestine over these years. Does that mean that the Arab street is something now separate from many of these Arab governments? And that's something interesting that we should discuss. Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian, who is a research fellow at Sectarianism, Proxies and Desectarianization, known as CPAD Project. He's joining us today from Riyadh. Joining us from New York is Nicholas Vincenzo Barney, who is a commentator, journalist, and writer. And joining us from Geneva is Dr. Ricardo Bocco, who is a professor of political sociology at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. Ricardo, Nicholas, and Abdulaziz, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Ricardo, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of such research? What do you make of the idea that the Arab street and Arab public itself may not be in agreement with the normalization of ties with Israel?
I think it's not surprising. Actually, the pattern of having Arab civil societies, or the Arab street as you called it, against the opinion of their rulers is more often the case than not. We have already seen it through what was called the Arab Spring, and this pattern is continuing today in the specific cases of a number of Gulf states where normalization has taken place. Of course, there are specificities that have to be taken into account for a state like Bahrain. The fact that, as you recall, the fact that the Arab population in those countries has been historically supportive of the Palestinian cause. It seems to be still the case, notwithstanding the choices made by their own rulers.
And Nicholas, what are your thoughts on that? Because, apart from I don't want to just talk about, for example, the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Emiratis. And beyond that, we also have the Moroccans and the Qataris as well, who are, against these sorts of deals as well. I mean, this shows that this is a lot more widespread than these specific countries, right, in the Persian Gulf. And even in Germany, in fact, there is also, even in Germany also, a concern about, Israel and the normalization of ties with that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it makes total sense. I don't find it surprising that it's as widespread as it is. Being a Bahraini, an Emirati, a Saudi, being from Qatar, and it's certainly being from Germany, as long as the public education doesn't fail you, authoritarianism when you see it, human rights abuse and human rights abusers when you see it, and that's what Israel is. And besides being those things, Israel also enables those tendencies in all the countries in the region there. I think you shouldn't underplay how much maybe the reaction of Arab leaders to Trump's decision to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem factors into this. There used to be in the 20th century a strong Arab unity and unification around Palestine, and that has really eroded from the top down, really just at the top in the last few decades. I don't think the people on the street have reacted well to the Arab leaders' response to that. But I also think there's a really big irony here, which is that whenever you criticize Israel, no matter if you're Israeli, no matter if you're Jewish, no matter if you're part of an international human rights organization, the reflexive response is to usually dismiss whatever you say as being anti-Semitic.
Okay, so Abdulaziz, I know that we can get bogged down in talking about each single one of these countries and their internal issues specifically. I don't want to get bogged down into that because I think that would be a minefield to get through, right? And there's a lot to discuss there in each individual country's part, pardon me. But I want to talk about the Arab Street as a whole throughout the Arab world, right? That was a concern when these Abraham Accords were announced to begin with, wasn't it? I mean, these normalization of ties. Is that a genuine concern? Do you think that the public and the UAE, for example, and Bahraini governments are in some ways not in sync on this issue?
Well, firstly, it's good to be with you again, Waqar. What I'd like to say about the Arab Street is that, firstly, I think it's very difficult to try to find a monolithic response because the Arab streets themselves are not unified. The Arab streets themselves is not monolithic. And what we have seen, especially after the post-Arab Spring era, is a different kind of preference, and in conjunction with different with different nationalisms rising in different Arab streets, and these different nationalisms, have a different voice, and they call for different things. Some people in the Arab streets, especially in the Gulf, some welcome some aspects of normalization because they find themselves too attached to the history. So, in my opinion, I think the reaction, a negative reaction from the Arab streets won't deter potential Arab states to normalize in the future. And I don't think it will pose as a significant obstacle. So it's just to what extent. And I think in recent years, with the rise of nationalism, especially after the Arab Spring, the question of normalizing relations with Israel has become slightly less of an obstacle, or dare I would say slightly more palatable, because it depends on the way it's being constructed and being sold to the people. If it's being sold as not really for peace, if it's saying, listen, this is for your interests, we haven't been able to change anything, we haven't been able to change any of the fundamentals that have been taking place or the realities that have been taking place, therefore we can't just sit and wait. Moreover, what's becoming far more distressing, I think, in my humble opinion, as an Arab also, is there have been attempts to try to highlight antagonisms, Arab antagonisms, and Palestinian Gulf antagonisms, and how they have been saying, well, hey, these are the people that you're defending. Look at what they say, and their people are saying and cursing towards your leadership, towards your flags, your emblems. And in my opinion, I think this is an exaggeration, because this is a tiny minority that's being amplified dramatically. This is what's pushing this discourse. And that's why I think there needs to be more studies to see the real depiction of what the realities are on the ground and how they view the Palestinian-Israeli situation far more accurately.
Okay. I wonder, what does all of this mean for Israel then? Because, you know, it was interesting, in fact, that I only found, or most of the talk and chatter about this on the internet was, in fact, in Israeli media. I believe it was Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel were most concerned about this poll. Do you think that this sort of a poll should concern the Israelis?
First of all, I would say that, of course, it concerns Israel, but there is an important point to underline, which is the fact that the Abraham Accords include a paragraph, a very important one, that has not been much explained or popularized by the media in the Arab countries. This paragraph concerns the recognition through the normalization accords that the Jews have the right to a state in Palestine. And this is the first let's say, agreement made by Israel with Arab partners, including the one with Jordan or Egypt, did not include this, let's say, historical clause. And this is very important for Israel, because in the debate over the legitimacy for being in Palestine for Jews and Palestinians, the Israelis are advancing in the road towards their Zionist vision of a greater Israel. So this is a point that has not been much, let's say, explained by the media in the Arab countries. This has been rather put under the carpet, and what has been made popular is rather the economic interest, trade, and whatever. So once this clause will become clearer to many stakeholders, this might have an impact also, between Arab countries, among Arab countries and rulers, but as well as for civil societies. Now,
okay, I'm going to come in, Ricardo. I do apologize because we just left, so I wanted to give both Nicholas and Abdulaziz a minute each to give their final comments before we let all three of you go. Nicholas, just quickly, if you can, tell us, what do you make of the Israel factor in all this? How does this affect Israel?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't affect Israel that much at all. The Trump administration has been the greatest thing for their interests, the greatest thing to happen to their interests in the last several decades. All the agreements in the region tilt in their direction. Their military supremacy in the region is unquestioned. I think at the end of the day, as long as that stays as is, and there's no reason to see why it wouldn't, I think this really doesn't factor in. This doesn't affect Israel that much. Their supremacy in the region is unquestioned. And even with the Biden administration stepping in, I don't see that changing. I don't see the plight of the Palestinians lessening that to any great degree.
And Abdulaziz, what are your thoughts then about the Israeli factor here? I mean, this will, of course, hurt the Palestinians. I mean, the deals as they seemingly have been laid out.
I think when it comes to the deals, or when it comes to the study itself, the study itself, which one are you?
Both of the above, to be very honest. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is what I would say in short regarding the deals. In regarding to the deals, as one of the guests rightfully mentioned, it's trade deals. It's not really a peace deal. It's construed as normalization of interest, materialization of interest. Now, this circumnavigation, this avoiding and negating the Palestinian factor in these deals might bring prosperity to different Arab states and to Israel, but it will not bring peace to Israel because Palestinians are there and they have to deal with the Palestinians, and there cannot be a real peace, at least a shot at peace, without dealing without dealing with Palestinians.
Yeah.
Because they are a reality on the ground, and they have to be that. They have to be there. What they are banking on is trying to get Arabs to pressure Palestinians to accept something that they will not accept. In regards to the studies themselves, as a PhD myself who focused on Saudi foreign policy towards Israel, I try to understand what the reality was and what the perception, the Saudi perception was towards Israel from within Saudi. There have been a lot of obstacles. So therefore, all these different studies that have came about will depend on how it is constructed. And in regards to the recent developments and the recent normalization, it was constructed as a way that this is really a bottom-up desire from the people, that they wanted peace and that they wanted this. So it's all going to depend on how these studies are constructed and how it is delivered. And that's what I think we need to pay attention to. Perfect. How it's framed.
Yep. No, and that's a very good end on, Abdulaziz. We really appreciate all three of your time today. Abdulaziz speaking to us today from Riyadh, Nicholas speaking to us this morning from New York, and Ricardo taking his time out speaking to us from Geneva. We appreciate all of their expert insight. This is an extremely important poll, right? Because I think that there is an argument to be made that, as our guests alluded to as well, the Arab street, as I've called it, or the Arab populations, have been for quite a while now disconnected from many of their government's policies. And that can be argued on an individual basis, country by country, as some of our guests went through. But I don't want to make this about each individual country. It's about just what the issue is when it comes to Palestine and whether that support of Palestine is sliding in the minds of Arabs. And seemingly at this point, at least on the part of the majority populations around the Arab world, that has not yet happened. They are still very much supportive of the Palestinian cause and are still against Israeli policies towards Palestinians. Will that change in the future? It may very well. But there seems to be a disconnect right now vis-a-vis these normalization of ties. And that certainly is something which I imagine all these governments are taking into account vis-a-vis their respective. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss interesting research that has come out of an opinion researcher called Meru Blue. It's found that 78% of Americans believe that if the Electoral College formally declares Joe Biden as the winner of the U.S. election, which I believe will happen sometime on December 14th, if I'm not mistaken, that Trump should then accept defeat and begin a peaceful transition. Does this mean that they're allowing for Donald Trump to do what he is currently doing vis-a-vis the transition and holding it up and not conceding at this point in time the election? Interestingly, this poll also goes on to say that 54% of Americans believe that voter fraud has taken place. Does that mean that Donald Trump's rhetoric and narrative about the fact that voter fraud has taken place has taken hold and is possibly even true? Are those concerns genuine? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Grant Davis-Reher, who is a professor of political science and director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship. He's joining us this morning from Syracuse, New York. Grant, good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining us today. What do you make of this poll? It seems that it's not as black and white a case, right, at this point, on the part of the public's opinion?
Well, I'd be pretty suspicious of what this poll is actually telling us. I think this is a case where the context for a lot of those questions is really not something that is a likely outcome. It's really not real in that sense. And so I think what you're seeing in some of those responses is really a reflection of the support for the president being shown by proxy by saying, well, I think that fraud may have taken place. Some of the folks think that Trump should stay in office. I don't think these are real opinions. I think that they are demonstrations of support for the president, recognizing that those scenarios that are being asked about are extremely, extremely unlikely. And so what you're getting, I think, is a statement of values and support rather than a real opinion about what actions should be taken. And we can discuss that more if you like.
Sure. So, I mean, let's issue by issue then, right? Because the biggest issue, seemingly, of course, at least for Donald Trump and his supporters, is voter fraud. Do you think that that should be properly investigated before anything is confirmed vis-a-vis results?
Well, it's being investigated. The president is filing a number of lawsuits, and those lawsuits require judicial determination, and there has been no evidence so far of any kind of systematic fraud or widespread fraud. The methods that were used in this election cycle have been used before by many states. The difference this time is that other states were employing them because of the pandemic.
What happens next, do you think? I mean, right now we're waiting for A, the cases, and B, the Electoral College, right? Do you think the cases will go all the way up to the Supreme Court? Because, you know, there's the argument to be made that if the Supreme Court were to confirm the results, then that's pretty much game over for Donald Trump, too.
Yeah, that in terms of the divisiveness in the country, that would be probably the most helpful outcome. If the cases do go to the Supreme Court ultimately, or if some of them or one of them, I fully expect that the results will be verified, and then we will be moving on into a transition. What you're seeing right now is there are increasing numbers of Republicans that are peeling away from the president, elected officials, on this issue. And as this goes on, if the president stays as intransigent as he's been about the issue of whether he lost and whether to go ahead with a transition, he will become increasingly isolated. And if he continues on with this, at some point, say in early December, he'll really be an island unto himself. I fully expect all of this to be resolved in the month of November.
You know, there's a lot of talk out there about how what Donald Trump is doing is hurting democracy. But I wonder if that's an overstatement, though, because he is still very much within his rights to contest this election in the way he's doing, in the sense that he's contesting the results, not the election. And, you know, if there were to be proven not to go his way, I imagine he would have no choice but to give in. So, I mean, is this really against democracy? Isn't this actually instead proving that the democratic system as set up in the U.S. actually works?
Well, you said it better than I could have said it. I am in heated agreement with you. I think the story of this American election is one of the resiliency of American institutions. It's of the resiliency of our electoral process. And so we had this election under extremely difficult circumstances. Some states instituted what were for them new methods of gathering votes, looking at what was being done in the other states. And by and large, this system worked. It was a fairly smooth election, all things considered, despite some of the protests and despite some of the unrest. And so I think it's a story of really democratic success and democratic resiliency. Look, the democracies only really exist because of the internalized values of the citizens that are in them, and then the institutions that support those values and shore them up. And I think in the United States, we're far from perfect, but we have a pretty good arrangement of those institutions and of those values.
So that if I may then flip the narrative for a second, because it seems that there is and has been for a very long time, and not to say that Donald Trump doesn't make it easy, but there's been this wave of criticism of him, continuous waves and waves of criticism, right? And like I said, I'm not saying that he doesn't make it easy, but he is still the president, right? So, I mean, shouldn't everybody tone down things right now, especially considering if he does become the ex-president, he will still have been a president of the United States for 4 years. I mean, that's still a respectable position, and he does still very much have his base. I mean, doesn't the sort of rhetoric we're seeing coming out right now in media and on the part of politicians, Democrats mostly, and even some Republicans, isn't that just feeding into this continuous polarization of society?
It absolutely is. It's both a reflection of the polarization and it's a further cause of it. And so this kind of deep polarization between the parties, this deep divide between the Republicans and the Democrats exists both among elected officials and the citizens. It's been 40 years in the making in this country. It existed before Donald Trump, but certainly the Trump administration has exacerbated it and exaggerated the effects of it. And so the big question going forward is, what are we going to look like 4 years from now? Will we begin to ease away from this deep level of polarization and begin to make some mending of the fences? Or is this going to be the way that politics is going to be in this country for the foreseeable future? I think that's an open question right now.
You within that then, because I'm trying to make a very specific point here in my mind at least that I find it stands out, is that those on the side of the Democrats are very gung-ho on their side, right? And it seems that the gap and the bridge, or the lack of a bridge, pardon me, between the Republican side and the Democrat side continues to grow wider, and it's not just Republicans' fault, is it?
No, it's not. It's a plague on both their houses. And you mentioned the media. The media is an element in this as well, because one of the things that the media loves is conflict. And so they're going to be very interested in I do think, though, there is a growing body of evidence that there are a number of citizens in this country, perhaps even a majority, that really do want to see more cooperation and more compromise, a silent majority, if you will. And there are a growing number of members in Congress that are beginning to recognize this. So there are some rays of hope. There's an organization in Congress, for example, called the Problem Solvers. You can only join that caucus if you have a member of the opposite party join with you. And so this group has been growing. It was a factor in the negotiations on trying to get a second stimulus package. And so I think there is a constituency out there and a desire and a hunger to change this trajectory. Again, the real question is whether a President Biden or some Republican leaders can try to make some movement in doing that. But it's an open question.
You know, the worst case scenarios, right, Grant, are of civil unrest of any sort, even on a minimal scale. I imagine that would be a complete nightmare for a president like Biden to be able to handle. Do you think that he's well suited to be able to handle that and resolve such situations and to actually unite the country? Or do you think this is sort of beyond him, too, at this point?
Somewhere in the middle. I mean, no one person can unite the country just by dint of their own leadership. But they certainly can provide a model. They certainly can engage in conversations with the country. The president is really the only figure in our political system that's able to engage in a meaningful conversation with the entire nation. And so the tone that he has been setting so far, I think, is a helpful one. We'll see after January 20th, when he's in office, just how much he really institutionalizes that in the way that he deals with Congress and the way he deals with the Republican Party. But there are some signs of hope here. We're not going to fix this in 4 years. We're not going to fix this in 10 years. But I think we could move away from the depth of the polarization over the course of the next political generation. Because again, it was 40 years in the making. The forces that brought us to where we are really tectonic forces in the economy, in political geography, in the way the media operates, in the messaging of candidates, in the messaging of outside parties who spend money on campaigns. There's just a whole lot of different forces here. And so it's going to take a major culture change to try to fix the problem.
Yeah. Very well. I'll have to leave there as a final word, Grant, but we sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us this morning. That was Grant Davis-Reher speaking to us this morning from Syracuse, New York, sharing his expert insight on this poll and, of course, about the latest of the U.S. election fallout. I mean, Donald Trump, again, not yet conceding. All the polls, I mean, not even the polls, actually, the election results show that Biden is winning by fairly significant margins. Nevertheless, I mean, he doesn't have to concede right now. Now, even according to the law, I mean, he doesn't even have to concede, I don't think, for the transition to necessarily take place. But yes, he's making life that much harder for his successor now, who will be coming into the White House with sort of a deficit, if I may call it that, in some ways, because he will not have had then access to those national security briefings, et cetera, that he needs to or should have access to be able to hit the ground running when he does then take over the presidency of the United States. There's a lot, of course, at issue here, because there's also a huge group of people that still support Donald Trump and still vehemently back him when he says that voter fraud has taken place. How does one convince them then that Biden is then the legitimate president of the United States? I imagine that's an extremely tall order, which we'll have to wait and see if Biden is really up to the task of doing that. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.